The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the tall windows of Lady Beatrice Chalfont's drawing-room, casting long shadows across the worn Turkish carpet that Eleanor Whitmore had memorized every thread of during her 6 months as companion to her wealthy aunt. April 3rd, 1816, marked exactly half a year since her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and the faded grey muslin dress she currently wore, its hem carefully mended where she had caught it on a rose thorn last summer, when life had still held the promise of respectable poverty rather than complete ruin. Eleanor's needle moved in precise, practiced strokes across the embroidery hoop, creating delicate violets along the edge of a handkerchief that would grace some fortunate lady's trousseau, though never her own. For at 26 years of age she had long since accepted that her grey eyes and unremarkable features would condemn her to a lifetime of creating beauty for others while remaining invisible herself. The cool spring air threatened rain, and Eleanor shifted closer to the window to catch the dying light, her fingers never pausing in their work as she listened to the murmur of voices from the hallway where callers came and went, none ever asking for Miss Whitmore, none ever noticing the silent figure in grey who blended into the background like another piece of furniture. She had become quite accomplished at the art of invisibility, of making herself useful without being seen, of swallowing the bitter taste of pride that rose in her throat whenever she remembered that she was Baron Whitmore's daughter, educated and accomplished, reduced to dependence on an aunt who had married well while Eleanor's father had gambled poorly. The voices in the hallway grew louder, and Eleanor recognized the oily tones of Sir Thomas Archer, her father's distant cousin, who had inherited what little remained of the family's good name, while somehow managing to acquire the majority of their debts through a series of card games her father had been too desperate to refuse. Her needle stilled as Sir Thomas's words drifted through the partially open door, speaking to someone about calling in old debts, about how patience had run its course, about how certain parties had enjoyed his generosity long enough, and Eleanor's heart began to pound as she realized he was speaking of her family's obligations that fell to her now as the eldest daughter with no brother to shoulder the burden. Maria, sweet Maria, who was only 19 and still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, whose future depended entirely on Eleanor's ability to maintain their precarious position in society long enough to see her respectably settled, would be ruined if Sir Thomas made good on his threats, and Eleanor's fingers trembled as she forced herself to continue the careful stitches, each one a small act of defiance against the fate that seemed determined to crush what little remained of her dignity beneath the weight of circumstances beyond her control. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The candles cast flickering shadows across the walls of Lady Beatrice Chalfont's private sitting room as Eleanor entered on unsteady legs, her grey muslin dress still damp at the hem from her hurried retreat through the garden after overhearing Sir Thomas's threats, and she found her aunt seated before the dying fire with an expression of calculation that Eleanor had learned to recognize over the past 6 months as the precursor to one of her elaborate social maneuvers. "Sit down, child, before you collapse," Lady Beatrice commanded, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's pallor and the way her hands trembled despite her attempts to hide them in the folds of her skirt. And Eleanor sank into the chair opposite, grateful for the support as the full weight of their situation crashed over her like the rain now pelting against the windows. "I heard Sir Thomas in the hallway," Eleanor began, but her aunt raised a jeweled hand to silence her, the emeralds catching the firelight as she leaned forward with an intensity that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with fresh anxiety. "Sir Thomas Archer is a vulture who has been circling our family's corpse for far too long," Lady Beatrice said with a venom that surprised Eleanor, for her aunt rarely displayed such open emotion about family matters, preferring to maintain the facade of genteel indifference that society expected. He has given us 3 months to settle your father's debts, or he will make them public, which would not only ruin you, but destroy any chance Maria has of making a respectable match." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Heavier now with the confirmation of a deadline that seemed impossibly short. "The sum is considerable," her aunt continued, rising to pace before the fireplace, her silk skirts rustling with each turn. "Far more than I can spare without my husband's knowledge, and you know how he feels about your father's gambling." Eleanor did know, remembered the icy reception at her uncle's funeral when she and Maria had been grudgingly taken in, remembered the careful balance her aunt had maintained between family duty and marital harmony. "There is, however, another solution," Lady Beatrice said slowly, turning to fix Eleanor with a look that was equal parts sympathy and determination. "One that could not only clear the debt, but establish you and Maria in society permanently." Eleanor waited, knowing from experience that her aunt's schemes were as intricate as the embroidery Eleanor created, each thread carefully placed to create a larger pattern. "The Duke of Ravenscroft has returned to London for the season," her aunt announced, and Eleanor frowned, trying to place the name among the countless titles and connections her aunt tracked with military precision. "Frederick Ashworth, they call him the War Duke, scarred and cold and utterly uninterested in the young misses thrown at him by ambitious mammas." Lady Beatrice returned to her seat, leaning close enough that Eleanor could smell her lavender perfume. "He has peculiar requirements for a wife, they say. Someone with intelligence and composure, rather than beauty and simpering accomplishments. Someone who will not bore him or cling. And, my dear, you need not love him, child. You need only make others believe he could love you." The spring sunshine of April 10th streamed through the tall windows of Lady Beatrice's morning room, illuminating the blue silk morning dress Eleanor wore with uncomfortable awareness, a gift from her aunt that transformed her from invisible companion to reluctant player in a dangerous game that had consumed her thoughts for the past week since the scheme was proposed. Lord Philip Greville sat across from them, his military bearing evident even in the delicate chair that seemed too small for his frame, and Eleanor found herself studying the way his fingers drummed against his knee as he spoke of his closest friend, with a mixture of exasperation and deep loyalty that made her stomach twist with fresh guilt. "Frederick is the finest man I know," Lord Philip was saying, his voice carrying the weight of shared battlefields and survived horrors. "But the war changed him in ways that London society cannot comprehend, and these ambitious mothers, throwing their daughters at him like ammunition, only drive him deeper into his fortress of solitude." Eleanor forced her hands to remain still in her lap, fighting the urge to smooth the unfamiliar silk that made her feel like an imposter, while her aunt leaned forward with the calculated interest of a general planning a campaign. "The scar troubles them, I suppose," Lady Beatrice ventured delicately, and Lord Philip's jaw tightened before he responded with barely controlled anger. "The scar that he earned pulling 3 men from a burning artillery position while French grapeshot tore through the air around him. The scar that represents the lives he saved at the cost of what society considers handsome. Yes, that troubles these vapid creatures who see only a damaged duke rather than a hero who sacrificed his face for his men." The passion in his defense of his friend made Eleanor's rehearsed responses crumble in her throat, replaced by genuine curiosity about this man who inspired such fierce loyalty, this cold duke who apparently despised the very pretense she was prepared to offer him. "His mother's dying wish was that he marry and produce an heir," Lord Philip continued more quietly. "And Frederick honors his mother's memory even as he rejects every simpering miss paraded before him, 14 at last count, including Lady Lydia Montague, who has made quite a spectacle of her pursuit." Eleanor felt her aunt's sharp gaze upon her. the unspoken reminder that their plan depended on succeeding where 14 others had failed, that they had only 2 months and 3 weeks remaining before Sir Thomas's deadline would destroy them, and she summoned the courage to speak the words she had practiced before her mirror. "Lord Greville, I wonder if you might perform an introduction at the Pemberton Ball next week, as I believe His Grace and I might find interesting conversation regarding the Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius, whose writings I understand he admires." The words sounded stilted to her own ears, too calculated, too obvious, but Lord Philip's eyes lit with surprised interest as he studied her with the tactical assessment of a soldier recognizing unexpected terrain, and after a long moment he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features as he replied, "Miss Whitmore, I believe that is the first sensible suggestion I have heard regarding Frederick in 2 years, and I would be delighted to arrange an introduction between you and a man who desperately needs to remember that not all women are empty-headed fortune hunters, though I warn you that he has become quite skilled at detecting false interest and will not tolerate any form of deception." The heat of the Pemberton ballroom pressed against Eleanor like a living thing as she stood in the corner by the potted ferns on April 17th, her borrowed pale blue gown feeling like costume armor that offered no real protection from the scrutiny of London society. And she watched the swirling dancers with the detached observation of someone who had long ago accepted her role as wallflower, while her heart hammered against her ribs with the knowledge that somewhere in this glittering crowd moved the man she was meant to ensnare. The past week since Lord Philip's promise had crawled by with agonizing slowness, each day bringing fresh doubts about the wisdom of their scheme. And now that the moment had arrived, Eleanor found herself fighting the overwhelming urge to flee to the safety of the retiring room, where she could hide until her aunt's carriage was ready to depart. The windows along the far wall had fogged with the warmth of too many bodies in too small a space, creating a dreamlike quality to the proceedings that made Eleanor feel as though she moved through water. Every gesture weighted with significance she could not escape. And she pressed herself deeper into her corner, the one partially hidden by the greenery where she had learned to make herself invisible at such gatherings. Lady Lydia Montague swept past in a cloud of French perfume and rose silk, her beauty so perfect it seemed almost aggressive, and Eleanor caught the calculating way her eyes swept the room, clearly hunting for her ducal prey with the single-minded determination of a seasoned campaigner who had never known defeat. The music swelled into another waltz, and Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, remembering Lord Philip's warning that Frederick despised pretense, wondering how she could possibly succeed in deceiving a man who had survived Napoleon's worst through tactical brilliance and an ability to see through enemy stratagems. When she opened her eyes, the crowd near the entrance was shifting, a ripple of awareness passing through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, and Eleanor knew, without being told, that he had arrived, the war duke whose very name caused matrons to whisper and debutantes to flutter, though she could not yet see him through the press of bodies. The whispers reached her corner, carried on the breath of gossip that was London society's lifeblood. Speaking of his late arrival and the way he had merely nodded to their hostess before moving through the room like a wolf among sheep, and Eleanor found her hands trembling as she smoothed them against her skirts, reminding herself that this was merely another performance. No different from the countless times she had made herself agreeable to her aunt's guests while dying inside from the weight of her invisibility. Then the crowd parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and Eleanor saw him for the first time, and her carefully rehearsed expectations crumbled like paper in flame as Frederick Ashworth moved through the ballroom with a presence that had nothing to do with his title and everything to do with the way he carried himself, as though he still walked battlefields where every step might be his last. His evening coat was perfectly cut black superfine that emphasized his broad shoulders, But it was his face that held her transfixed, not because of the scar that carved a path across his left cheek, as she had been warned, but because of the way his dark eyes moved across the room with the tactical assessment of a commander surveying terrain, missing nothing, dismissing everything, until suddenly, impossibly, they found hers across the length of the ballroom and stopped. The moment stretched between them across the ballroom like a taut wire, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from those dark eyes that held hers with an intensity that made her forget every carefully rehearsed word she had prepared for this meeting, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain everyone in the room must hear it, as Frederick Ashworth began moving toward her with the deliberate purpose of a man who had found his objective. Time seemed to slow as he crossed the space between them, and Eleanor watched with growing panic as Lady Lydia Montague attempted to intercept him with a flutter of rose silk and practiced smiles, only to be dismissed with a curt nod that left the beauty standing frozen in shock, while he continued his approach toward the corner where Eleanor had thought herself safely invisible. The crowd parted before him with a mixture of awe and apprehension, and Eleanor found herself pressing back against the cool marble pillar behind her, acutely aware that she had nowhere to retreat and no script to follow for what came next, because in all their planning, neither she nor her aunt had truly believed the War Duke would notice her, much less seek her out with such obvious intent. When he finally stood before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hours squinting into battlefield smoke, Eleanor realized with a start that she had forgotten to curtsy, frozen as she was by the unexpected warmth in his expression that contradicted every rumor of his coldness. "You did not curtsy when I approached," he observed, his voice carrying a hint of amusement that transformed his scarred features into something almost boyish, and Eleanor heard herself responding before her mind could catch up with her tongue. "You did not bow when you arrived, Your Grace, so I assumed we were dispensing with formalities." The words hung in the air between them, and Eleanor immediately wished she could recall them, certain she had just ruined everything with her impertinence. But instead of the cold dismissal she expected, Frederick's lips curved into what might have been his first genuine smile in months. "Marcus Aurelius wrote that what we do now echoes in eternity," he said, the non sequitur catching her completely off guard until she realized he was testing her, and without thinking she completed the quote, "Though I believe he was speaking of virtue rather than social proprieties, Your Grace." The surprise that flickered across his features was quickly replaced by something that looked dangerously like delight, and Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as he stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Miss Whitmore, I presume, as Philip described you perfectly, though he failed to mention your wit." The warmth of his presence was overwhelming, and Eleanor found herself responding to his nearness in ways that had nothing to do with their carefully orchestrated plan, her skin tingling with awareness as he continued, "I find myself curious about a woman who quotes Stoic philosophers while hidden among the potted ferns, and I wonder if you might honor me with a turn about the garden where we can discuss virtue and propriety without the accompaniment of this insufferable waltz." The invitation was delivered with such understated charm that Eleanor found herself nodding before remembering she was supposed to be playing a role. And as Frederick offered his arm, with a formality that belied the intensity still burning in his eyes, she placed her hand on his sleeve and allowed him to lead her toward the French doors. Aware that every eye in the ballroom was upon them, and that Lady Lydia Montague looked ready to shatter her fan from the force of her grip, while somewhere behind them, Eleanor could feel her aunt's satisfaction radiating like heat from a fire. The cool night air of the Pemberton garden wrapped around Eleanor like silk as she stepped through the French doors on Frederick's arm, the sudden quiet after the ballroom's cacophony, making her acutely aware of every small sound, from the whisper of her borrowed gown against the stone terrace to the distant splash of the ornamental fountain, and she found herself holding her breath as he guided her down the shallow steps with a careful attention that made her forget this was meant to be a performance. The garden lanterns cast pools of golden light along the gravel path, creating an intimate world separate from the glittering artifice they had left behind, and Eleanor caught the sweet scent of jasmine blooming somewhere in the darkness, its perfume mixing with the subtle spice of Frederick's cologne in a way that made her head swim with dangerous thoughts she had no business entertaining. "I must confess," Frederick said, his voice lower and more relaxed than it had been in the ballroom, "that I generally despise these affairs, finding them filled with empty chatter and emptier people, yet tonight I find myself grateful to our hostess for her dedication to social torture." Eleanor felt a laugh escape before she could stop it, genuine and unguarded, and she immediately tried to recover her composure, reminding herself that she was supposed to be playing a role, not enjoying herself. But Frederick's answering smile made such thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. "You speak as though you have survived a great ordeal, Your Grace," she managed, trying to inject the proper amount of flattery into her tone, but he shook his head with amusement that transformed his scarred features into something almost boyish. "Have I not? 3 hours of avoiding matchmaking mammas and their simpering daughters, dodging conversation about weather and fashion, pretending interest in the latest gossip from Almack's, all while that infernal orchestra murders Mozart with enthusiasm if not skill." The path curved deeper into the garden, and Eleanor found herself relaxing despite her best intentions, drawn into his irreverent humor that stood in such stark contrast to the cold, emotionless warrior of rumor. And when they reached a small stone bench beneath a trellis heavy with early roses, she felt only the slightest hesitation before accepting his silent invitation to sit. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," he said, settling beside her with a proximity that would have been scandalous in the ballroom but seemed perfectly natural in this jasmine-scented darkness. "What drives a woman who can complete Marcus Aurelius quotations to hide among the potted ferns at social gatherings?" Eleanor knew she should deliver her prepared response about modesty and proper feminine reserve, but something in his genuine interest made the lies stick in her throat, and instead she found herself speaking a dangerous half-truth. "Perhaps I find more wisdom in philosophy than in social posturing, Your Grace, though I suspect that marks me as irredeemably blue-stocking." "Irredeemably interesting, rather," he corrected, and before she could respond, he was standing and extending his hand to help her navigate a slightly raised portion of the path, his fingers closing around hers with a warmth that sent shivers through her entire body. And when they had crossed the obstacle, neither of them seemed inclined to let go, their hands remaining clasped as they continued their circuit of the garden. "I should tell you," Frederick said suddenly, his thumb tracing an absent pattern against her glove that made coherent thought nearly impossible, "that I intend to call on you tomorrow, and the day after that, and very probably the day after that as well, unless you have some pressing objection to the company of battle-scarred dukes who quote stoic philosophers and despise social niceties." The words were delivered with a lightness that did not match the intensity in his eyes when Eleanor looked up at him, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the careful plan she and her aunt had constructed crumbling in the face of this unexpected, impossible, utterly sincere interest from a man who was supposed to be incapable of feeling. "I have no objection, Your Grace," she heard herself whisper, and knew with a sinking certainty that she was already lost. Because the elation that flooded through her when he smiled had nothing to do with saving her family from ruin, and everything to do with the way his hand tightened around hers, as though she were something precious he had found, and did not intend to release. Eleanor had not slept at all, the memory of Frederick's hand holding hers playing through her mind like a melody she could not stop humming. And when the morning sun finally streamed through her bedroom window on April the 18th, 1816, she found herself already dressed in her best morning gown of cream muslin, pacing before the parlor window like a soldier awaiting orders, telling herself repeatedly that the flutter in her stomach was merely nerves about their deception, and nothing whatsoever to do with the way his eyes had softened when he smiled at her in the garden. The clock on the mantel had barely struck 11 when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones, far too early for a proper morning call, and her heart leaped traitorously in her chest as she watched Frederick alight from his gleaming black phaeton with an eagerness that would have shocked society had they witnessed it, his usual rigid formality replaced by something almost boyish in the way he took the front steps 2 at a time. Aunt Beatrice, who had been watching Eleanor's agitation with barely concealed satisfaction, arranged herself on the settee with theatrical precision, her knowing smile making Eleanor want to flee to her room. But before she could escape, their butler was announcing, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft." And Frederick was striding into the morning room with a package wrapped in brown paper that he carried as carefully as if it contained something infinitely precious. The servants scattered like leaves before wind, well trained in the art of discretion, and Eleanor found herself rising to curtsy, only to be stopped by Frederick's raised hand and the warmth in his voice as he said, "I thought we had agreed to dispense with such formalities, Miss Whitmore, though I confess your aunt's presence requires me to observe at least some proprieties, hence my arrival at this barely respectable hour, rather than at dawn when I first considered calling." The confession, delivered with such disarming honesty, made Aunt Beatrice emit a sound somewhere between a cough and a laugh, and she rose with surprising grace for a woman of her years, declaring, "I believe I hear my correspondence calling from the library, though I shall leave the door quite open for propriety's sake, which I trust will satisfy both decorum and conversation," before sweeping from the room with a rustle of purple silk that left Eleanor alone with Frederick, and the package he now extended toward her with an expression of unexpected uncertainty. "I hope you will not think me presumptuous," he said, and Eleanor noticed for the first time that he had a small scar near his right temple that had been hidden by his hair at the ball. "But after our conversation last evening, I found myself unable to sleep, thinking of how you completed Marcus Aurelius so readily, and I remembered I had this in my library, a first edition of his Meditations that has traveled with me through Spain and Portugal, through battles and long nights when I thought I might never see England again, and I thought perhaps you might appreciate it more than it deserves, gathering dust on my shelves." Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped the book, revealing leather worn soft by handling, and pages that bore the marks of frequent reading, margin notes in Frederick's precise handwriting that made this gift infinitely more intimate than any jewel could have been, and she found herself blinking back sudden tears at the generosity of it, this piece of his history placed so trustingly in her unworthy hands. "Your Grace, I cannot possibly accept something so personal," she managed, though her fingers traced the spine with reverence that betrayed her words, and Frederick stepped closer, his voice dropping to that low register that seemed to vibrate through her very bones as he said, "I do not give gifts lightly, Miss Whitmore, for I find that most people treat them as carelessly as they treat words. But when I give something, I mean for it to be kept, treasured even, as I hope you will treasure this and remember that some battles are won not through force, but through patience and understanding." The weight of his words settled around them like a cloak, and Eleanor understood suddenly that he was speaking of more than just the book, that this was a declaration of intent as clear as any spoken vow, and she clutched the volume to her chest as if it could shield her from the growing certainty that she was falling in love with this man she was meant to deceive. "Now," Frederick continued, his manner lightening though his eyes remained intent on hers. "I find myself with a curricle in need of companionship, and a lovely morning that demands appreciation. And I wonder if you might consent to a drive through Hyde Park, where we can discuss the good Emperor's thoughts on duty versus desire without your aunt's purple presence hovering in the doorway, charming though she undoubtedly is." The invitation was delivered with such perfect timing that Eleanor could not help but laugh, the sound bright and genuine in the morning air, and she found herself nodding before duty could reassert itself, already imagining the gossip that would fly through London's drawing-rooms when the War Duke was seen driving out with the nobody companion of Lady Chalfont, though in that moment, with Frederick's smile warming her like sunshine and the precious weight of his book in her hands, she could not bring herself to care about anything beyond the dangerous joy of spending another hour in his company, telling herself that surely one more day of pretense could not hurt, even as her heart whispered that she was lying to herself more effectively than she had ever lied to him. The late afternoon sun of April 25th, 1816, painted Hyde Park in shades of gold and green as Frederick guided his curricle along the fashionable drive, Eleanor beside him in a carriage dress of soft lavender that her aunt had insisted upon, and she found herself marvelling at how natural this had become over the past week of daily visits and rides, the way society now expected to see them together. The way her heart leaped when his carriage appeared at precisely 4 o'clock each day without fail. "You grow quiet, Miss Whitmore," Frederick observed, his hands steady on the reins as they passed a group of matrons whose fans fluttered with gossip at the sight of them, "though I have come to learn that your silences often contain more thought than most people's conversations, a quality I find increasingly indispensable." Eleanor felt the familiar warmth his compliments always brought, tinged now with guilt that had grown heavier with each passing day, each genuine smile he bestowed upon her feeling like another stone added to the weight she carried, and she forced herself to respond lightly. "Perhaps I am merely admiring the beauty of the park, Your Grace, though I confess my thoughts often wander during these drives to matters beyond the immediate scenery." "Indeed? And where do they wander?" he asked, slowing the horses as they approached a quieter section of the path, his profile showing that particular expression of interest she had come to recognize, the way his scarred cheek would tighten slightly when he was truly engaged in their conversation. "Sometimes I think of the future," she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could guard it, "and wonder at the strangeness of fate, how lives can change course so suddenly, like a river diverted by an unexpected storm." Frederick was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her breath catch. "I know something of unexpected diversions, having spent years believing my path was set in military stone, only to find myself here, discovering that perhaps what I thought I wanted and what I actually need are entirely different things." The words hung between them like a confession, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict with the certainty that she was falling in love with this man who spoke to her as an equal, who sought her opinions on everything from philosophy to politics, who had somehow seen past her plain exterior to find something worth pursuing, and the knowledge that it was all built on deception made her want to weep. "Speaking of the future," Frederick continued, his tone lightening though his eyes remained serious, "I have been thinking of Ravenscroft Hall, my estate in Derbyshire, which has been too long without a proper mistress to oversee its restoration. And I find myself imagining how certain intelligent grey eyes might survey its rooms, what changes certain capable hands might make to transform that cold monument to past glories into something resembling a home." The implication in his words was clear as crystal, and Eleanor felt her hands tremble in her lap as she realized how far beyond their original plan this had progressed, how what was meant to be a simple ruse to attract other suitors had become something real and precious, and utterly impossible to maintain. "Your Grace," she began, but her words were cut short by a familiar voice calling her name with a tone that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Cousin Eleanor, what a delightful surprise," Sir Thomas Archer drawled as he guided his own mount alongside their carriage. His smile sharp as a blade, and his eyes glittering with malicious knowledge that made Eleanor's stomach turn to lead. Though perhaps not such a surprise, given the fascinating gossip one hears in the clubs these days about your sudden elevation in society. Frederick's demeanor shifted instantly from warm companion to the war duke of his reputation, his shoulders straightening and his eyes narrowing as he assessed this unexpected threat with the same tactical precision he had once applied to enemy positions, and his voice when he spoke was cold enough to frost glass. "I do not believe we have been introduced, sir, and I find myself curious about your presumption in approaching Miss Whitmore with such familiarity." "Sir Thomas Archer, your Grace," her cousin replied with a bow that somehow managed to be both obsequious and mocking. "Eleanor's dear cousin, deeply concerned for her welfare in these uncertain times, particularly given the delicate nature of family obligations that I fear may have been forgotten in the excitement of new acquaintances." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable, and Eleanor felt the color drain from her face as she realized that somehow Sir Thomas knew about the deception, that he held the power to destroy not just her, but Frederick's reputation as well. And she watched in growing horror as his smile widened at her obvious distress. "I trust, cousin, that you will remember our appointment to discuss family matters at your earliest convenience," Sir Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, even as he addressed Frederick with feigned respect. "As there are pressing concerns that require immediate attention, matters that I am certain His Grace would not wish to see become public knowledge, being a man who values discretion as highly as he is reputed to do." Frederick's hand moved slightly on the reins, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might strike Sir Thomas despite the public setting, but instead he merely inclined his head with icy politeness and said, "Miss Whitmore's family matters are naturally of concern to me as well, Sir Thomas, and I trust that any business you have with her can be conducted with the propriety and respect due to a lady under my particular protection." The words rang with possessive authority that would have thrilled Eleanor under different circumstances, but now only deepened her despair as she realized how much Frederick had already invested in their connection, how much he stood to lose when the truth inevitably emerged. And as Sir Thomas rode away with a knowing smirk, she felt the walls of her deception beginning to crumble around her, knowing that her cousin would demand either more money than they could ever raise or her complete withdrawal from Frederick's life, and either option would lead to the destruction of this beautiful, impossible dream she had foolishly allowed herself to believe might somehow become real. Eleanor had not slept a single hour on the night of April the 25th, 1816, Sir Thomas's threats echoing through her mind like church bells tolling for a funeral, and as the grey dawn of April 26th crept through her bedroom curtains, she found herself already dressed in a simple morning gown, her hands trembling as she held the precious first edition of Marcus Aurelius that Frederick had given her just days ago, knowing what she must do even as every fibre of her being rebelled against it. The book felt impossibly heavy in her hands, weighted with all the unspoken promises it represented, all the intellectual conversations they had shared over its pages, the way Frederick's eyes would light up when she offered a particularly insightful observation about duty and virtue, and she pressed it against her chest one final time before wrapping it carefully in brown paper, her tears falling silently onto the wrapping as she worked. By the time she descended to the morning room, her face was composed into a mask of calm that cost her everything to maintain. Though Aunt Beatrice took one look at her and set down her teacup with a sharp clink that spoke volumes, her shrewd eyes narrowing as she observed, "My dear child, You look as though you have seen a ghost, or perhaps created one of your own making." Eleanor could not meet her aunt's gaze, instead moving to the window where she had watched for Frederick's arrival so many mornings, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "I must end this charade, Aunt Beatrice, before it destroys us all, for Sir Thomas knows everything, and threatens to expose not just our deception, but to demand sums we could never hope to pay, and I cannot, will not, allow the Duke to be tarnished by association with our schemes." The clock on the mantel seemed to tick impossibly loudly in the silence that followed, and Eleanor clutched the wrapped book like a shield, knowing that Frederick would arrive soon for their planned morning ride, that she would have to look into those dark eyes that had grown so warm in recent days and deliberately extinguish whatever feeling had begun to grow there. "You love him," Aunt Beatrice stated. Not a question, but a declaration delivered with the certainty of one who had observed too much to be fooled. "And what is worse, you believe he might love you in return, which terrifies you more than any threat Sir Thomas could make." The truth of her aunt's words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. But before she could respond, the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones announced Frederick's arrival, earlier than usual, as had become his habit. And Eleanor's heart clenched painfully as she watched him alight with that particular energy he seemed to reserve for their meetings, unaware that she was about to shatter whatever future he had begun to envision. When he entered the morning room, his smile was so genuine, so unguarded, that Eleanor nearly lost her resolve. But the weight of the book in her hands reminded her of what she must do, and she held it out to him before he could speak, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall as she said, "Your Grace, I must return this to you, for I find I cannot accept such a precious gift when I fear you have formed an attachment where none can flourish, and I think it best if we discontinue our morning rides before society begins to expect announcements that cannot, should not, be made." The transformation in Frederick's expression was terrible to witness, the warmth draining from his eyes to be replaced by something cold and tactical. The war duke emerging from beneath the gentle suitor he had allowed himself to become, and his voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet. "Cannot flourish, Miss Whitmore, or will not be permitted to flourish, for I find there is a significant difference between the two, and I have learned to recognize when an enemy position is being fortified against me." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, even as her heart shattered with each word she spoke. "There is no enemy here, Your Grace. Merely a woman who has remembered her place in society, and wishes to spare you the embarrassment of an attachment to one so far beneath your station, one who has nothing to offer but scandal and disappointment." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she pressed on, driven by the desperate need to protect him from the truth of their deception, from the mockery that would follow if society learned he had been fooled by a nobody's schemes, and she watched as his jaw tightened, that small muscle she had come to know so well, flexing with suppressed emotion as he absorbed her words with the same stoic dignity he must have shown on countless battlefields, though she could see the hurt flickering beneath his controlled exterior like lightning behind storm clouds. The late afternoon rain that had begun during Frederick's morning visit to the Chalfont townhouse on April the 26th, 1816, had intensified into a steady downpour by the time he burst through the door unannounced at 4:30, his greatcoat dripping and his expression thunderous as he strode past the startled butler with the same decisive purpose he had once used to breach enemy lines, finding Eleanor in the drawing-room where she sat pretending to read while actually staring unseeing at the same page she had turned to hours ago. "Your Grace," she started, rising hastily and nearly dropping the book she had been clutching like a lifeline, "I was not expecting you to return today. Indeed, I thought I had made my position quite clear this morning regarding the unsuitability of our continued association. But Frederick was having none of her careful distance, crossing the room in 3 swift strides to stand before her, close enough that she could see the raindrops still clinging to his dark hair, close enough that the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with rain, and something uniquely him made her heart clench painfully. "Clear as mud, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and controlled, but vibrating with suppressed emotion. "For I find that your sudden reversal coincides rather remarkably with your cousin's appearance yesterday, a man whose reputation for gaming debts and blackmail is well known in certain circles, though perhaps you believed me too removed from society's underbelly to be aware of such creatures." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face at his words, her knees suddenly weak as she realized he had been investigating, applying that formidable intelligence that had made him such a successful military commander to the puzzle of her behavior, and she sank back onto the settee as he continued relentlessly. "I have stormed fortresses with less resistance than you offer, Miss Whitmore, taken cities with less elaborate defenses than those you have suddenly erected between us, and I find myself curious what threat Sir Thomas Archer holds over you that would make you attempt to sacrifice what I had begun to hope was a mutual regard." The truth of it, that he had hope regarding their connection, nearly undid her completely, and she pressed her hands together to stop their trembling as she tried once more to deflect him. "Your Grace mistakes courtesy for regard, mistakes gratitude for deeper feeling, and I beg you to accept my withdrawal with the dignity befitting your station, rather than pursuing explanations that can only bring pain to all involved." Frederick made a sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor, moving to stand by the window where the rain-streaked glass cast shifting shadows across his scarred cheek, and when he spoke again, his voice held a different quality, softer, but no less intense. "Do you know what Philip told me when I asked him to look into your situation, Miss Whitmore? What he discovered about your father's debts and your cousin's hold over your family, about the desperate measures you and your aunt have been forced to consider to save your sister from ruin?" Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was answer enough, and Frederick turned from the window to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away as he continued. "I know about the £3,000 owed to various creditors, know about Sir Thomas buying up the debts to gain power over you, know even about the original plan to use my courtship to attract other suitors, though I confess that last discovery stung my pride rather more than enemy grape shot ever did." The words hung between them like a physical presence, the truth finally in the open, laid bare with military precision, and Eleanor found herself unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at this man who had somehow uncovered everything, yet stood before her without the rage or disgust she had expected, only a kind of fierce determination that was almost more frightening than anger would have been. "But do you know what else Philip discovered in his investigations?" Frederick asked, moving closer again, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "He discovered that somewhere between that first meeting in the ballroom and yesterday's ride in Hyde Park, something changed, something that has nothing to do with schemes or debts or attracting other suitors, something that made you try to protect me even at the cost of your own happiness. And I find myself most curious about that transformation, Miss Whitmore, most curious indeed." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his perception, at the way he had seen through not just her deception, but her attempts to shield him, and her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "You were not supposed to be kind, Your Grace, not supposed to bring me books, or ask my opinions, or smile in that particular way when I make you laugh. And I cannot bear the thought of you believing I encouraged your regard for mercenary reasons when the truth is so much more complicated than that." Frederick's expression softened at her words, And he did something then that shocked her utterly, sinking to one knee beside the settee so that their eyes were level, taking her trembling hands in his larger ones with a gentleness that spoke of carefully controlled strength, and his voice when he spoke was rough with emotion. "Then tell me the complicated truth, Eleanor, for I find I am done with pretense and society's games, done with careful distance and proper addresses, and I need to know whether what I have felt growing between us these past weeks exists outside the boundaries of whatever scheme you began with. Need to know if I am alone in feeling that my world has shifted on its axis since that night you looked at me across a crowded ballroom and did not look away." The week that followed Frederick's confrontation on April the 26th had been the longest of Eleanor's life, each day stretching endlessly as she waited for the inevitable moment when he would discover the full truth of her deception and cast her aside with the disgust she deserved. Yet inexplicably, he continued to call each morning at precisely 11 o'clock, bringing small gifts that seemed chosen specifically to torment her guilty heart, a translation of Sappho's poetry that made her weep with its verses about impossible love, a small watercolor of jasmine flowers that she knew he must have commissioned specially and most painfully, his continued gentle courtesy, even as she maintained a cold distance that clearly wounded him. By the evening of May the 3rd, 1816, Eleanor had retreated so far into herself that she barely noticed when Aunt Beatrice excused herself from the parlor with unusual haste, leaving Eleanor alone with her embroidery in the dimly lit room where the fire had burned low and shadows gathered in the corners like visible manifestations of her despair, wearing again the grey dress she had sworn never to don after that first night in the garden, as if reverting to her invisible state might somehow undo all the damage she had caused. The sound of Frederick's voice in the hallway should not have surprised her, for he had taken to arriving at unexpected hours as if hoping to catch her with her defences lowered, but something in his tone, as he thanked the butler, made her hands still on her needlework, a quality of resolve that sent a shiver of premonition down her spine, even before he entered the room, and she saw his expression, grave and determined, in a way that told her the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and she noticed he had reverted to the formal address after a week of being denied the use of her Christian name. "I believe it is time we dispensed with all pretense between us, for I find I can no longer bear this elaborate dance of withdrawal and pursuit when I have information that renders it entirely unnecessary." Eleanor's heart seemed to stop entirely as he moved to stand before the fireplace, his profile illuminated by the dying embers as he continued in that same measured tone that she recognized from their discussions of military strategy. "Lord Philip has been quite thorough in his investigations, as I knew he would be, and I now know everything. Your father's debts of £3,000, Sir Thomas's purchase of those debts to gain leverage over you, the original plan to use my courtship to attract other suitors who might offer for you and provide the funds to save your family from ruin." The words fell between them like stones into still water, each one creating ripples of consequence that Eleanor knew would drown them both. And she found she could not speak, could not even raise her eyes from the forgotten embroidery in her lap as Frederick continued relentlessly, "I know too about Sir Thomas's threats to expose your poverty if you did not extract a proposal from me within 3 months, know about his additional demands for money when he realized I was genuinely attached, know even about your attempt to protect me from scandal by ending our association before the truth could destroy my reputation." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Eleanor waited for the condemnation that must surely come, for the cold fury of a man who had been played for a fool. But instead she heard something else entirely in his voice when he spoke again. "What Sir Thomas did not know, what perhaps even you do not fully understand, is that I recognized the deception from nearly the beginning, Eleanor, for I have spent too many years reading the enemy's intentions to miss the signs of a campaign, however prettily disguised. This finally made her look up, meeting his dark eyes with shock and confusion as he turned from the fireplace to face her fully, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth that held no humor but something infinitely more complex. Your aunt is not as subtle as she believes, and your own transparency when you forgot to maintain your role told me everything I needed to know about the authenticity of your feelings, how they evolved from performance to reality, despite your best efforts to prevent it. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as he moved closer, sinking into the chair across from her rather than maintaining his commanding position by the fire, leaning forward with an intensity that made it impossible to look away as he continued. What I did not expect was to find myself equally transformed, to discover that what began as mild intrigue at your refusal to simper became something far deeper, far more essential to my continued existence than I believed possible after returning from war, convinced my capacity for tender feeling had been burned away on battlefields. The tears were flowing freely now as Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document that he placed on the small table between them, his voice gentling as he revealed the final truth. I paid Sir Thomas's debt in full 2 days ago, Eleanor, not because I was deceived or manipulated into doing so, but because I could not bear to see you suffer another moment under his threats, could not stand the thought of you accepting another man's proposal out of desperation when everything in me knows you belong with me, just as I belong with you, scheme or no scheme. The document lay between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged broken and barely audible. You knew. All this time you knew, and yet you stayed. You continued to court me, even knowing I had begun with deception. Why would you do such a thing when you could have any woman in England, women who would never dream of scheming against you? Frederick's answer came swift and certain, his hand reaching across the small space between them to capture hers, his touch warm and real and impossible to deny. Because somewhere between that first night in the garden and now, Eleanor Whitmore, you stopped pretending and started simply being. And the woman you are when you forget to perform is worth more than all the titled ladies in London who see only my rank and fortune, for you see me, the man beneath the scars and reputation, and that is worth any scheme, any deception, any price that must be paid. The silence that followed Frederick's revelation hung in the air like a physical presence as Eleanor stared at the document that proved her family's salvation, her tears falling unchecked while she struggled to comprehend that this man, this remarkable, impossible man, had known of her deception and chosen to love her anyway, not despite it, but perhaps even because of it, for it had shown him the woman she truly was beneath the schemes and desperation. How can you speak of belonging when I began with lies? She whispered, her voice breaking on the words, even as her fingers tightened involuntarily around his, unable to release this connection, even as she felt unworthy of it. How can you offer me freedom from debt without making me a different kind of debtor, owing you everything while deserving nothing? Frederick's response was to rise from his chair and move around the small table, sinking to his knees before her in a gesture that would have scandalized society, but felt entirely right in this moment, his hands capturing both of hers as he looked up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You owe me nothing, Eleanor, for what I did was as much for my own sake as yours, perhaps more so, because the thought of you married to another man to save your family, of never seeing you again, of watching you disappear into some loveless union when every instinct tells me you were meant to be mine. That thought was more unbearable than any wound I sustained in battle. The firelight cast shadows across his scarred cheek as he continued, his voice rough with emotion. Do you think I care that you began with deception when that deception brought you into my life, when it gave me the chance to know the woman who quotes Marcus Aurelius and argues philosophy with the passion of a scholar, who sees beyond this scar to the man beneath, who made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond mere survival. Eleanor found herself sliding from the settee to kneel with him, propriety forgotten in the face of this raw honesty, her hands rising to frame his face as she had longed to do so many times before, her thumbs tracing the line of his scar with infinite tenderness. "I stopped pretending the moment you smiled at me in the garden," she confessed, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Stopped being able to separate the role from the reality, because you made me forget I was supposed to be performing, made me feel seen and valued and alive in ways I had never imagined possible, and I have been terrified every moment since that you would discover not just the deception, but the depth of feeling behind it, and find me presumptuous for daring to love so far above my station." Frederick turned his face to press his lips against her palm, the gesture so tender it drew a sob from her throat as he murmured against her skin, "Above your station? Eleanor, my darling, brilliant, impossible woman, you have no idea what you have done to me. How you have transformed me from the hollow shell who returned from war into something resembling a whole man again. How your supposed presumption in loving me is the greatest gift I have ever received." The world beyond the parlor ceased to exist as Frederick drew her closer, their foreheads touching in an intimacy more profound than any kiss. And when he spoke again, his words were a vow, a promise, a declaration of intent that brooked no argument. "Marry me, Eleanor Whitmore, not because of debts or schemes or the pressures of society, but because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. Because you have become essential to my very existence. Because I would rather face 1,000 battles than spend another day wondering if you might have been mine, if I had only been brave enough to ask." Eleanor's answer came not in words, but in the way she closed the final distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted of tears and joy and the promise of all the years to come. A kiss that sealed not just their engagement, but the transformation of what had begun in deception into something pure and true and unshakable. While outside the rain continued to fall like a benediction on a love that had found its way through lies to truth, through schemes to sincerity, through the elaborate games of society, to the simple, essential recognition of two souls who had always been meant to find each other. The morning of May the 4th, 1816, dawned with a brilliance that seemed to mock the tumultuous emotions of the previous evening, as Eleanor stood at her bedroom window watching the sun paint the London streets in shades of gold and rose, her fingers unconsciously touching her lips where Frederick's kiss still burned like a brand, marking her as irrevocably his, even as her practical mind struggled to accept the miraculous turn of events that had transformed her from scheming deceiver to beloved fiancé in the space of a single confession. The household had erupted into barely contained chaos the moment Frederick had departed, Aunt Beatrice abandoning all pretense of surprise as she swept Eleanor into her arms with tears of genuine joy streaming down her powdered cheeks, exclaiming that she had known from the first that her dear girl was destined for greatness. Conveniently forgetting that the entire scheme had been her own design, while the servants whispered excitedly in the corridors about the war duke's unprecedented display of emotion, kneeling before their mistress like a knight of old rather than the cold, commanding figure society expected. Eleanor had slept not at all, her mind replaying every moment of Frederick's revelation, from his admission that he had known of her deception almost from the beginning, to his fierce declaration that she belonged with him, the memory of his scarred face transformed by tenderness as he spoke of transformation and redemption, making her heart race anew with wonder that such a man could truly want her. Plain Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent years believing herself invisible and worthless. The sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs drew her from her reverie, and she turned to find her maid, Mary, bearing a note on a silver tray, her young face glowing with vicarious excitement as she bobbed a curtsy and announced breathlessly that His Grace had already sent word this morning, as if he could not bear to wait even until the proper calling hour to communicate with his intended bride. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the ducal seal, finding Frederick's bold script filling the page with words that made her sink onto the window seat in shock. My dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this, the announcement of our engagement will already be in the morning papers, for I find I cannot bear another hour of uncertainty regarding your place in my life and in society's eyes. I trust you will forgive my presumption in acting without consultation, but having nearly lost you to misguided nobility and the machinations of lesser men, I am determined that nothing shall prevent our union. I will call at 11 to discuss our future, including your journey to Ravenscroft Hall to meet Mrs. Langdon and begin making the estate your home. Until then, know that you carry with you all my devotion, Frederick. The reality of it crashed over Eleanor like a wave, that this was truly happening, that she who had resigned herself to a life of genteel poverty and dependence was now engaged to one of the most powerful peers in England, not through manipulation or schemes, but through a love that had grown despite, and perhaps because of, the complicated path that had brought them together, transforming what had begun in desperation into something precious and true that neither of them had expected to find. The announcement in the Times that morning sent ripples through every fashionable drawing room in London, the stark black print proclaiming to all society that His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft, was engaged to marry Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a match so unexpected and unprecedented that Lady Jersey nearly fainted into her morning chocolate, while at Almack's the gossip reached such a fever pitch that even the patronesses abandoned their usual reserve to speculate wildly about how such an unlikely union had come to pass. Eleanor found herself besieged from the moment the papers were delivered, calling cards accumulating on the silver tray in the entrance hall like autumn leaves, while Aunt Beatrice fielded inquiries with the satisfied air of a general who has won a decisive battle, turning away the merely curious while accepting only those calls from families who had previously ignored Eleanor's very existence, but now found themselves eager to claim acquaintance with the future Duchess of Ravenscroft. The transformation in how society viewed her was both dizzying and deeply unsettling to Eleanor, who watched from the morning-room window as carriages drew up to the house in an endless stream, their occupants peering eagerly at the windows as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had somehow captured the uncapturable war duke, their expressions ranging from envious curiosity to barely concealed disbelief that plain, poor Eleanor Whitmore had succeeded where celebrated beauties had failed. When Frederick arrived precisely at 11, as promised, the crowd of carriages outside parted like the Red Sea, their occupants craning their necks to observe him as he strode up the steps with military precision, his scarred face set in lines that discouraged any attempt at congratulation from those brave enough to consider approaching him, though Eleanor noticed with a secret thrill that his expression softened the moment he entered the house and caught sight of her waiting in the entrance hall. "My dear," he said, taking her hands in his with a proprietary air that sent whispers racing through the servants gathered discreetly in doorways. "I trust you have forgiven my presumption in making our engagement public without consultation, though I confess I would have done so regardless, for I find myself quite unable to tolerate any ambiguity regarding your place in my life or in society's acknowledgement of it. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the possessive note in his voice, even as she struggled to reconcile this new reality with the fact that mere weeks ago she had been invisible to these same people, now clamoring for her attention, and she found herself gripping Frederick's hands perhaps tighter than was proper, as she replied with complete honesty. "Your Grace, I find myself somewhat overwhelmed by the response, for I had not realized how dramatically my circumstances would alter simply by virtue of your name being linked with mine, though I suppose I should have anticipated that society would react strongly to news of your engagement to anyone, let alone to someone of my modest position." Frederick's response was to draw her closer, seeming entirely unconcerned by the watching servants as he raised one of her hands to his lips in a gesture that managed to be both perfectly proper and somehow intensely intimate, his dark eyes holding hers as he murmured against her gloved fingers, "Your position was never modest, Eleanor, merely unrecognized by those too blind to see true worth when it stood before them, and I confess I take a certain satisfaction in watching them scramble to acknowledge what I knew from our first conversation in that ballroom, that you are extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with birth or fortune, and everything to do with the remarkable mind and heart that I am privileged to claim as my own." The journey to Ravenscroft Hall commenced on May 10th, 1816, a date Eleanor would remember forever as the day she left behind the familiar confines of London society to embrace an uncertain future as mistress of one of England's grandest estates, though as the ducal carriage rolled through the countryside with Frederick seated beside her, his presence both comforting and slightly overwhelming in the intimate space, she found herself more concerned with the man than the manner that awaited her arrival. The morning had dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself conspired to bless their journey, and Eleanor had dressed with particular care in a travelling dress of deep blue wool that Frederick had sent to her, along with an entire wardrobe he had commissioned from the most exclusive modiste in London. Each garment a testament to his determination that she should never again feel less than any woman in society, though Eleanor had protested the extravagance until Aunt Beatrice had firmly reminded her that a duchess could not go about in made-over gowns and borrowed finery. The carriage was luxuriously appointed with velvet cushions and brass fittings that gleamed in the morning light, but Eleanor found herself most aware of Frederick's proximity, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers when the carriage swayed, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with leather and the fresh flowers he had thoughtfully provided for the journey, white roses and jasmine that filled the space with their sweetness and reminded her of their first walk in the garden. As London gave way to rolling countryside, Frederick began to speak of Ravenscroft Hall with a warmth she had rarely heard in his voice, describing the ancient oak avenue that led to the house, the rose garden his mother had cultivated with such devotion, the library that contained over 10,000 volumes, including several rare manuscripts he thought might interest her, and most touchingly, the suite of rooms that had belonged to the Duchesses of Ravenscroft for 3 centuries, and which Mrs. Langdon was even now preparing for Eleanor's arrival. "I confess I have not visited those rooms since my mother's passing," Frederick said quietly, his hand finding hers across the space between them, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that had become natural between them despite the short duration of their courtship. "But Mrs. Langdon assures me they have been maintained perfectly, waiting for the next Duchess to bring them back to life, and I find myself eager to see you there, to watch Ravenscroft bloom again under your care, as I suspect it has been waiting to do since grief dimmed its halls." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the trust implicit in his words, the way he spoke of their future as if it were already written in stone, rather than something still fragile and new between them. And she found herself squeezing his hand as she replied with complete honesty, "Your Grace, I only hope I can be worthy of such a legacy, though I confess the prospect of meeting Mrs. Langdon fills me with more trepidation than facing all the dowagers of Almack's, for she has known you since childhood, and will surely see through any pretense to the truth of whether I deserve the honor of becoming mistress of your home and heart." Frederick's response to Eleanor's concern about Mrs. Langdon was a smile that transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing between them, as he said with quiet confidence, "My dear Eleanor, Mrs. Langdon has been waiting for someone like you for longer than she would care to admit, and I suspect she will adore you within moments of meeting, for she has an unerring ability to recognize genuine goodness when she encounters it, a skill honed by years of protecting me from those who sought only my title or fortune." The carriage continued its steady progress through increasingly familiar territory, at least to Frederick, who pointed out landmarks with the enthusiasm of a man sharing treasured memories, showing Eleanor the village where he had learned to ride, the stream where he and Philip had spent countless summer afternoons fishing and plotting their future military careers, the ancient stone church where generations of Ashworths lay buried, and where, he added with a meaningful glance that made Eleanor's breath catch, they would soon speak their own vows. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the countryside in shades of gold and amber, Frederick grew quieter, his expression taking on a quality Eleanor had learned to recognize as his deepest contemplation, until finally he turned to her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken as he said, "Eleanor, there is something I must tell you before we arrive at Ravenscroft, something I have not spoken of to anyone save Philip, and even then only in the darkest hours when the memories threatened to overwhelm me." Eleanor felt her heart constrict at the vulnerability in his voice. This man who had faced Napoleon's armies without flinching, now struggling to find words for whatever weighed upon his soul. And she turned more fully toward him, both hands now clasping his as she said softly, "Frederick, you may tell me anything, for I hope you know by now that there is nothing you could share that would alter my feelings for you. Nothing that would make me see you as anything less than the remarkable man I have come to." She paused, the word love trembling on her lips, though she had not yet spoken it aloud, and Frederick's eyes darkened with emotion as he completed her thought. "As I have come to love you, my darling Eleanor, more than I believed possible after what I witnessed in the war, after the things I did in the name of king and country that left me certain I had forfeited any right to the kind of happiness you have brought into my life." The confession hung between them in the intimate space of the carriage, and Eleanor found herself lifting one hand to touch his scarred cheek, feeling him lean into her palm as she whispered, "Tell me, my love, for your burdens are mine to share now, as mine have become yours." And in that moment, as the carriage wheels continued their steady rhythm against the road that would lead them home, Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that whatever shadows haunted Frederick's past, whatever guilt or pain he carried from his years of war, she would help him bear them just as he had lifted the crushing weight of her family's debt and her own sense of worthlessness, transforming them both through the simple, revolutionary act of truly seeing and accepting one another. Frederick's confession began as the carriage wheels turned steadily beneath them, his voice taking on a quality Eleanor had never heard before, raw and unguarded as he spoke of a village in Spain where his regiment had been ordered to make an example, where the line between soldier and monster had blurred beyond recognition in the smoke and screams of that terrible day when he had followed orders that haunted him still, orders that had earned him commendations and nightmares in equal measure. "We had intelligence that French sympathizers were hiding weapons there," he said, his gaze fixed on their joined hands, as if he could not bear to see judgment in her eyes. "But when we arrived, we found only farmers and their families, old men and women who looked at us with such fear, such terrible recognition of what was to come. And I should have questioned the orders, should have demanded proof, but I was the War Duke, the one who never hesitated, never showed mercy that might be perceived as weakness. Eleanor felt his hands tremble in hers as he continued, describing how he had stood in that dusty square while his men searched homes and found nothing but cooking pots and farming tools, how the colonel had insisted they proceed with the example anyway, to maintain fear in the region, how Frederick had been faced with a choice between his conscience and his duty, between the man he wished to be and the soldier he had been moulded into through years of brutal campaigns. I refused, he said simply, though Eleanor could hear the echo of that moment's agony in his voice. I countermanded the colonel's direct order in front of the men, declared that we would not harm civilians without evidence of treachery, and in that moment I knew I was ending my military career, possibly facing court-martial, certainly destroying the reputation I had built as the Crown's most reliable weapon. The scar on his cheek seemed more pronounced in the fading light as he finally raised his eyes to meet Eleanor's, and she saw in them such a mixture of old pain and new hope that her heart ached for him as he continued. The colonel drew his pistol, whether to shoot me or one of the villagers as an example I will never know, because Private Morrison, barely 17 years old and terrified, tried to stop him, and in the struggle the gun discharged, the bullet grazing my face and killing the colonel instantly, an accident that I took responsibility for to protect Morrison, claiming the colonel had been about to fire on civilians, and I had intervened. Eleanor found herself touching his scarred cheek again, understanding now that it represented not the glory of battle, but the price of conscience. The physical mark of the moment Frederick had chosen his humanity over his reputation, and she whispered, "You saved them all, those villagers and your men's souls as well." But Frederick shook his head, his voice rough with emotion as he replied, "I saved them that day, but what of all the days before when I did not refuse, when I followed orders without question, when I earned my reputation as the War Duke through actions that efficiency demanded, but honor should have forbidden?" The carriage had grown silent, save for the rhythmic sounds of horses and wheels, and Eleanor felt the weight of Frederick's confession settling between them like something sacred and terrible. A trust so profound that she understood instinctively he had never shared these words with another living soul, not even Philip, who had witnessed so much of his wartime existence, and she found herself overwhelmed not by horror at what he had done, but by a fierce, protective love for this man who judged himself so harshly for the sins of survival in circumstances no civilized person should ever face. She kept her hand pressed to his scarred cheek, feeling the raised tissue beneath her palm, this physical testament to the moment he had chosen conscience over career. And when she spoke, her voice carried a conviction that surprised even herself as she said, "Frederick, you speak of the days before as though you had choices you failed to make, but I have read enough history to know that soldiers who question every order in the midst of battle do not survive long enough to question anything at all, and the fact that you reached a point where you could no longer proceed, where your humanity reasserted itself despite years of conditioning to suppress it, that is not evidence of your failure, but proof of your fundamental goodness." He tried to turn away, but she held his face gently, refusing to let him retreat into the familiar fortress of self-condemnation as she continued. "You were barely more than a boy when you went to war, shaped by men who valued efficiency over mercy, praised for the very qualities you now despise in yourself. And yet when it mattered most, when following orders would have been easier than resistance, you chose to protect innocent lives at the cost of everything you had built. And that choice, my love, that is who you truly are." The tears that Frederick had held back through his entire confession finally escaped, sliding silently down his cheeks and over Eleanor's fingers, and she felt her own eyes burning as she witnessed this proud, guarded man allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way that war and society had taught him to view as weakness. And she understood then that healing him would be the work of years, perhaps a lifetime. But she welcomed that work as the greatest privilege she could imagine. "I am not worthy of you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. But Eleanor shook her head firmly, moving closer on the carriage seat until their foreheads touched, until she could feel his breath mingling with hers as she replied, "We are neither of us worthy of forgiveness, if worthiness is the measure, for I came to you with deception in my heart and desperation driving my every action, and yet you forgave me without hesitation. You saw past my pretense to something real beneath. So how can you deny yourself the same grace you extended so freely to me?" The carriage rounded a bend, and suddenly the landscape opened before them, revealing in the golden light of late afternoon a magnificent estate rising from manicured grounds, its honey-colored stone glowing warm against the deepening blue of the sky. And Frederick lifted his head to follow Eleanor's astonished gaze as he said simply, "Welcome to Ravenscroft Hall, my darling. Welcome home." The great house rose before them like something from a dream Eleanor had never dared to dream, its symmetrical wings stretching wide as if to embrace the approaching carriage, and she found herself gripping Frederick's hand more tightly as they passed through iron gates bearing the Ashworth crest. A raven in flight above crossed swords, the metal worn smooth by generations of arrivals and departures that had preceded this moment when she, Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of an impoverished baron and lately a companion surviving on her aunt's charity, was being welcomed as the future mistress of this magnificent estate. The drive curved through parkland dotted with ancient oaks, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze, and Eleanor caught glimpses of a lake glittering gold in the fading sunlight of formal gardens stretching toward the horizon, of tenant cottages visible in the distance with smoke rising from their chimneys. And she understood suddenly the weight of responsibility that Frederick carried, not merely for himself, but for the hundreds of lives that depended upon Ravenscroft's prosperity, the families who had served this estate for generations and who would now look to her as their duchess. Frederick watched her face as they approached, and Eleanor saw in his expression something vulnerable beneath the pride, a hope that she would love this place as he did, that she would see past the grandeur to the home he wished to build with her within these walls. And when she turned to him with tears brightening her eyes, and whispered that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, his smile transformed his scarred face into something so tender that she had to look away or risk weeping openly before they even reached the door. The carriage halted before the main entrance, where a line of servants had assembled in formal greeting, and Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at the scrutiny she was about to face. But Frederick descended first, and turned to hand her down with such obvious care, such evident pride in presenting her to his household, that she found her spine straightening and her chin lifting as she had seen her mother do in better days before poverty had bent them all beneath its weight. Mrs. Martha Langdon stood at the head of the servants, a formidable woman with silver threading her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. And Eleanor understood immediately that this woman's approval would matter greatly in the household Eleanor hoped to build, so she met that assessing gaze directly and offered a warm smile rather than the distant nod that might have been expected from an arriving future duchess. The housekeeper's expression flickered with something like surprised approval before she dipped into a curtsy and said, "Welcome to Ravenscroft Hall, Miss Whitmore. We have been expecting you." And though the words were formal, Eleanor heard beneath them a genuine welcome that Frederick's letters must have encouraged, a household prepared to receive not merely their master's bride, but a woman he had described in terms that had clearly softened hearts, long loyal to him alone. Frederick led Eleanor through the great oak doors and into an entrance hall that seemed designed to humble visitors with its magnificence, Yet she found herself noticing not the soaring ceilings or the ancestral portraits lining the walls, but the subtle signs of a house that had been waiting for warmth. Fresh flowers arranged with obvious care in crystal vases, fires burning in hearths that might otherwise have stood cold, candles lit in windows as though guiding someone home after a long journey. And she understood that these preparations had been made for her, that Frederick had sent word ahead to ensure that Ravenscroft would welcome its future mistress with every comfort the staff could provide. Mrs. Langdon took charge with quiet efficiency, directing footmen to carry their luggage and maids to prepare rooms, sir. But Eleanor noticed how the housekeeper's sharp eyes continually returned to Frederick, checking for signs of fatigue or distress with the practiced attention of someone who had watched over him for years. And when their gazes met, Eleanor saw in that weathered face a silent question about whether this young woman would be worthy of the man Mrs. Langdon had helped raise from boyhood, the man she had welcomed home broken from war and slowly nursed back to something resembling wholeness. Frederick seemed unaware of these undercurrents as he guided Eleanor through the main rooms, his voice taking on an animation she had rarely heard as he described the history contained within these walls, the generations of Ashworths who had built and expanded and loved and grieved within these spaces. And she recognized that he was sharing not merely a house, but his entire heritage, trusting her with the accumulated weight of centuries, inviting her to add her own chapter to this long story of a family and an estate intertwined. They paused before a portrait in the long gallery, and Eleanor found herself looking at a woman with Frederick's dark eyes and his stubborn chin, painted in the style of the previous century, with roses in her hair and a secret smile playing about her lips. And Frederick said quietly that this was his mother, painted the year before his birth, and that she had died when he was 12, leaving him to his father's harsh tutelage, and eventually to the army that had made him what he was. Eleanor studied the portrait and saw kindness in those painted eyes, imagined the boy Frederick must have been when this gentle presence was taken from him, and she understood better now the walls he had built around his heart, the defenses that war had only strengthened, and she made a silent promise to the woman in the portrait that she would spend her life helping to heal the wounds that loss and violence had carved into this man who deserved so much more than fate had given him. The evening deepened around them as they completed their tour, and when Mrs. Langdon finally insisted that Miss Whitmore must be exhausted from travel and should be shown to her chambers, Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave Frederick's side, even for the few hours until dinner. A sentiment she saw reflected in his eyes as he raised her hand to his lips and murmured that Ravenscroft had never seemed so alive as it did tonight, with her walking its halls beside him at last.